Hello and welcome to this chess opening video on the Sicilian Dragon. And let's see here. Today we have a game between, and it was a 2023 game between two grandmasters. And it looks like they both played in the 90th percentile for accuracy rating, 96% accuracy by Arjun Erigaisi, if I pronounced that correctly. And he's rated 2710 versus 2654 by his opponent with the white pieces. And let's see, this game, it looks like it was played in 2023, so a newer game. Let's see how you can breathe fire with the dragon and win. All right, so the game begins with knight to f3. And if you're thinking about trying the Sicilian Dragon, I have a playlist on it. And I started out with the Yugoslav attack, which is more attacking, whereas today we're going to show the classical variation of the Sicilian Dragon. And it transposes into that. It starts with a ready opening with knight to f3. And the classical opening, which I'll show you here when it begins, is a little more strategic. The Yugoslav attack, if you haven't seen that already in previous video, that's more attacking. So if you're more of a strategic player, you might want to play this classical variation as white. But either way, we'll see what black does here. So now we have the Sicilian defense. It usually begins with e4 by white, c5 by black. So white takes control in the center with this e-pawn. Black counterattacks in the center with the c-pawn and discourages an immediate d4 pawn push. And that's why the knight comes up to help facilitate that pawn being thrown forward. Otherwise, if it's captured, the queen would have to recapture, and then it could be chased in the center of the board there. All right, so d6. A move that fortifies this pawn, covers this square in case the knight wants to develop and it doesn't get pushed around by this pawn. So the standard move in the open Sicilian, and generally a lot of tactics can happen in the open Sicilian. It can get pretty complicated and there's a lot of theory, but don't be discouraged. Try it out. You might enjoy it. See what you think. So usually there's a capture here because white had two pawns in the center. So what happens here is black captures in the center with one of his flank pawns. So now he's left with two central pawns to white's only pawn in the center. But white has more space and he has this piece develop, a slight lead in development. So the knight usually attacks the unprotected pawn. It's defended by the knight. And now we have g6 here, the dragon variation. Why is this called the dragon variation? Well, maybe all these pawns here are the shape of a dragon, and the bishop usually develops here and will breathe fire down the long diagonal, and that bishop can be very dangerous in the Dragon Sicilian. So the game continues with this move, the classical variation, bringing the bishop here to e2. It's a little more passive but safer. There's still some tactics to watch out for, but it's not as dangerous and crazy and double-edged as the Yugoslav attack, which usually brings this bishop here immediately. So the game continues with bishop developing, and now we have castling to the king side by white. In the Yugoslav attack, white castles to the queen side, and then after opposite side castling, it's usually a race with a pawn storm on each side of the board. White would push all his pawns, black would push his pawns, and usually whoever breaks through first would have the advantage. And I discussed that a little bit in the previous Sicilian Dragon videos on the Yugoslav attack. But with the classical variation, if you're not into crazy, wild attacking games and you're more of a calm player, you might like this classical variation a little bit better. So now we have castling. Both sides are castled. And what will happen here? Well, white will probably try and attack towards the king side. Black, his central pawns are pointing over to the queen side. I mean, he could move here and the pawns would be pointed the other way, but that would leave this backwards D pawn. And, often you could move here and then try and facilitate a pawn push of the D pawn to D5. And that's something that Black often tries to do in the Sicilian. If he can get his pawn to D5, it usually frees up his game a little bit better. And, he should maybe be at least equal. So Black will probably concentrate on the queen side. Let's see what happens. Okay, now we have this bishop to E3 move, which makes sense. There's the bishop lined up on this knight. Often the other knight can jump forward, adding more pressure. So immediately the bishop develops, helps protect the knight in the center. And you could still try and bring the queen up in the future, maybe creating a battery, trying to exchange off this very valuable dark squared bishop of Black's, which is also helping defend the king and not only attacking down the diagonal. So the game continues with knight to C6 here. And we're on what? Move 8. We're still in book moves here. So now there's more pressure being added to this knight. So you have to watch out for tactics, possibly. I mean, at the moment, the knight is covered. So queen steps forward, creating that battery, as I mentioned, maybe with ideas of exchanging off the bishop. You have to watch out for possible tactics in the future of capturing here and attacking the queen, unleashing the bishop. But for now, we have more developing moves. Bishop to D7, getting closer to having all the pieces developed. White brings his rook to the center, trying to work up the half-open D file and also help guard that very important D5 square. Often in the Sicilian, that D5 square is very important, and a lot of play will revolve around it, where Black might try to push that pawn forward. And as I said, if he can manage to do that, it'll kind of free up his position and make life a little bit easier for him. White could have the possibility of pushing the F pawn here, maybe pushing it even further, perhaps trying to push this pawn in the future. But white has to be careful. If he starts pushing these pawns, trying to play on the king side, he could start weakening his king position. And Black, like I said, will probably try and get some play going on the queen side. Let's see. So rook to C8, another theme in the Sicilian, and especially in the Sicilian Dragon, where there's a half-open C file. And Black will try and play down that half-open file, sometimes sacrificing the rook for the exchange here of this knight and breaking apart the pawns on the king side, on the queen side. Sometimes that is played. All right. So now we have rook centralizing. White has completed development. His rooks are on a half-open file and on this file, which has a pawn pushed up the board already. So it gives that rook a little bit more space and could back up that pawn in the future. Okay, the game continues with this very thematic pawn move in the Sicilian. There's also the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian, which I'll probably do some videos on in the future, because if you're going to play against the Sicilian, there are just many options by Black. He could play the Sicilian Dragon like this. He could play the Najdorf, and there's quite a few possibilities. So what does this move do? Well, it keeps pieces out of B5. It also prepares the possible B5 pawn push for Black, which helps him get the ball rolling on the queen side to drum up some counterplay and attack over there. So we have a4 being played, discouraging that pawn push. Because, if that's played now, you would have capture, capture, and a pawn could be captured there. So this is another thematic move being played by black. Often the knight will jump here to e5, unleashing the rook on the half-open file. But more importantly, the knight has the opportunity to jump here to c4, and black can often try and do that, place a piece there on c4, and he'll attack this bishop here. He might be forced to exchange off one of his bishops and knock out white's bishop pair. So let's see how things continue. A kind of slower move here, but a preventative move, and it says this is the best move in the position according to the computer. And at this point, white has a slight edge, about a third of a pawn equivalent advantage. But this keeps the knights out of the king side over here. Also keeps the bishop out of there. So the game continues with the knight jumping forward, also the best move in the position. So the queen's under attack. The bishop is under attack. So I'm thinking white is probably forced to go ahead and capture here, which he does. And now after the recapture, white's bishop pair is gone. And that can be an advantage if you can get rid of your opponent's bishop pair, especially if you keep your own. Now black has this light squared bishop, and white has no bishop to counter that. So the bishop pair can favor the attacker. If you can find a way to use that bishop to put some pressure on your opponent, and it might be hard for them to stop it if they don't have their light squared bishop. All right, the pawn pushes forward. We have an attack on the rook. And this pawn is secure now, or more secure on a4, and the rook has to retreat. So what will be played here? The rook drops all the way back to c8, and the computer likes that move the best. White's advantage is a little more minimal now, about a quarter of a pawn advantage according to the computer at this point. So the game continues with bishop to g5, which lines up on the queen. Even though there's a knight and a pawn in the way, this move does line up a less valuable piece on the more valuable queen. And even though there's pawns, or a pawn and a knight in between, you never know when things will open up and you could have a discovered attack on that queen. All right, so the game continues with an inaccuracy being played here. All right, so this move, it looks like it gives up a pawn, but I guess that's a trap. If you take that pawn, well then after bishop, we'll take a look at that because that is interesting here. The best response is to give up your bishop by capturing on the knight on f6. So let's see what would happen if they capture that. So now, after bishop recaptures, queen captures, let's see what the damage would be here. Oh, now you have an unprotected knight, and that knight would be picked off. So you want to definitely avoid that. So now, oh, hold on, accidentally. All right, I guess that's what was played in the game. After h6, you do not want to take that pawn because the queen is also protecting this knight here. So bishop captures is best right here. And now, oh, okay, sorry. That would be the best move. Then the bishop would have to recapture. And then what? Knight up to d5, attacking the bishop. But then the bishop, what? Could move out to here. That looks a little riskier. let's see what happened in the game. We had this bishop retreat, which does loosen things up a little bit in the king side for black after he pushed that pawn. But this was an inaccuracy, not the best move, and now the game is about even. So e6 is being played, a good move, but the computer actually prefers g5. But perhaps black didn't want to open things up that much on his king side. All right, this move here gets closer to helping black to push to d5 in the future. And it also keeps that knight out of the d5 square. So the game continues with a knight retreat. The computer actually liked rook to e3 a little bit better, but those moves are about even. So the game continues with bishop up to c6. And now the bishop is a little more active, aiming down here towards white's king side. And maybe getting a step closer to pushing that pawn to d5 in the future. So the game continues with an attack on the bishop, trying to get rid of the bishop pair. What does black do here? Well, he ignores that and develops the queen, getting the queen out of the line of fire of that bishop as well. So we have a capture of the knight, the best move in the position, and now white is ahead a little bit more here now. Capture, the queen grabs this extra pawn, and even though white has the extra pawn, it's still only less than half a pawn advantage, even though he's ahead in material. So the game continues with the queen targeting this unprotected knight. Now we have a blunder move played by white. So this was not the best move. It looks like, what, queen to d2 had to be played. e3 or d2. The computer, I think it said it liked this move the most because it helps protect the knight. Now, what should be played? Queen to c5, putting pressure on the knight. Also this knight, once this bishop moves, the rook and queen could try and capture there. So that would have been better. Instead, we had this blunder move. Now, why was that played? I guess they thought they could get an attack on the king. If you have capture, well, then the queen could capture with check. And maybe that's looking a little bit dangerous for that black king. So let's see how things continue. We have the queen capture, an inaccuracy, but black is still ahead here. The computer actually prefers rook at f to e8, getting the rook out of the line of fire of that knight. So capture, the best move. Black is ahead here. So after a little bit of maneuvering, we have white retreating back, trying to consolidate. He's ahead by the equivalent of one pawn after the exchanges there. So rook to the half open file, creating a battery here. Also, we have the bishop queen battery, and this bishop aimed at the king side. So will the bishop pair versus the other rook be strong enough? Let's find out. So queen sidesteps out of the line of fire. This was an inaccuracy, and now black is almost winning. Apparently c4 would have been better, and often if we look at that, c4 is played in the Sicilian to really prevent that d5 pawn push, because then these double pawns, also known as the Maroczy bind, by placing these pawns on c4 and e4, really restricts that pawn from pushing to d5. Okay, after the inaccuracy, queen to d3, the pawn is able to push to d5, the best move in the position. And once that happens, that really helps black out in the game, and he's getting rid of his isolated pawn, which can be a weakness in the endgame. So not the best move. Apparently a counterattack with f4 would have been better. And of course you can't capture there because, if we go back, you can't capture or the queen would just take the rook there. Okay, so we have rooks doubling up on the queen. So now there is a threat of capturing that pawn with an attack here. So the game continues with, black capturing first. And now we have a tripling up here aimed at this pawn. So, maybe this one will get into the game and we'll start attacking up the e-file. Okay, bishop retreats. Rook grabs the open file. Now the bishop is repositioned, threatening this attack. So the game continues with a blocking move. And now we have another attack on the queen this time and lining up on the king. And I said that's usually a good idea to line up a less valuable piece on the more valuable pieces. Here, for example, the queen, not only the queen, but the king, because there could be, once that queen moves, depending where it goes, there could be a possibility of taking this pawn with check, and the pawn can't capture because of that bishop. So we have the best move being found by white, but at this point it looks like, according to the computer, white is lost. But the game continues with capture leading to doubled pawns, doubled isolated pawns. White's kingside pawn structure has been wrecked. And so the game continues with a pawn push, trying to open things up on that king with the bishop pair. And the bishop pair can be brutal with an open position on the board, especially if your king is not safe, it's hanging out in the open. Also, there's this possibility of the bishop targeting both of those rooks. So the game continues with the best move. Pretty interesting here. Now, if the pawn captures, well, then we could have capture. Then this drops back. Then, I don't know, maybe a pin on that, and you could go back here and target this. But let's see what happened. The bishop launches into f3 here, targeting the rooks. The game continues with capture. And now it's really looking grim here for white. So the final moves in the game, we have capture, king steps back, and white's pawns are just falling at this point. And it's not, it's looking even worse. So the game continues with a check, king steps forward. Now rook on the 7th rank, usually a good idea here, but the pawn calmly steps forward, protected by the bishop, and the game continues with pawn stepping forward. White is trying to get some type of counterplay. If we look at material, though, he's just down a bishop, so not good at all for white. Now, he did succeed in breaking these pawns up, so after an attack on the bishop, well, now what? We have the rook defending, and here the game ended. So, I don't know, I hope that was an interesting example for you if you're thinking about playing the Sicilian Dragon. Now, the classical variation, white doesn't always get in trouble like this. It can be a good, solid, strategic answer to the Sicilian Dragon. If you don't like the Yugoslav attack, which the Yugoslav attack is probably the most, what's the word here? If you want to really test the dragon, the Yugoslav attack is probably the best way to do that. But the games can get crazier and more tactical and counter-attacking with pawn storms on both sides of the board. So if you like things to be calmer, you might want to try this classical variation. All right, well, feel free to leave any kind of comments, especially if you have requests for something you'd like to see in the future. Also, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.